Hi, Chelsea.
Hi, Eric.
Good to have you here in the studio again, as we have for a few.
Yeah, always nice to be here.
I have a question for you. And have you heard of the supply chain?
Yes, actually, I've been hearing about it quite a bit recently in regards to cybersecurity, but I don't know that much about it. It seems pretty important, though.
It comes up a lot, but yeah. So, and I think you're not alone in that.
Yeah.
Even some of us that work with it, we hear about it, we understand a little bit about it, but I think there's a lot more that we could understand about just what the supply chain means, what it is, maybe why it's such a hot topic. Is it really that fragile? And why should we all care?
Well, it's coming up more and more, so I'm assuming it is important.
I think it's good that everybody knows a little more about it, us included, myself included. So maybe it's something we should explore.
Yeah, I mean, let's dive in. You can educate me.
We all have some splaining to do, right?
We do.
Cool. So, Chelsea, we want to talk about the supply chain, which I think a lot of our listeners have probably heard the word used or the words used, supply chain, and have some idea or think they know what it means. I thought I did at one point, and then I learned there's actually not just one supply chain. There's different ways of looking at the supply chain. I think physically, we can go back to and the pandemic recently for a lot of folks made it a little more apparent. It brought it into common discussions around the physical supply chain, the more tangible analog supply chain of getting things to people. And does that resonate or make sense? You remember how that played out? You know,
oh yeah,
there were things you couldn't
anything.
get.
Yeah,
and that was a disruption in one level of the analog, real world, physical supply chain of paper goods or whatever,
like furniture, stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even toilet paper to be a little crude. There were things that you just couldn't buy because somewhere along the supply chain, it was being disrupted. And that could have been manufacturing, delivery, retail, can't go to the store. So there are all these different things. And I think it's a good illustration for anyone of how complex a supply chain can be and then how susceptible it can be, because if any one of those links in the chain, using the analogy of a chain, is broken, the whole thing fails.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's one physical type of supply chain. There's another supply chain that comes up probably a little bit more often in cybersecurity, which has to do with software delivery and updates and all that. And we're going to dive into that. But to do that, we have a guest with us that I'm very excited. I've been looking forward to having him on. I've done some other cool digital media with him in the past. I've known Mark for a long time, at least a couple decades, over 20 years, something like that, before both of us were in our positions where we are now too. But I'm happy to welcome in Mark Ostrowski, Mr. Oz, the wizard himself, who is currently serving, if I have it right, as head of engineering US East for Checkpoint Software. Is that the correct title? And yes or no? And then you could expand a little bit on what that means, because I know it puts you in front of a lot of customers, a lot of clients, a lot of users with a lot of interesting discussions, and helps give you a broad perspective on cybersecurity issues.
Yeah, I know. Well, first, Chelsea and Eric, thanks for having me. Look forward to it. And always a pleasure, Eric. Like you said, we go back quite some time, and it's always good to sit down with you and to kind of talk about this stuff. I enjoy it very much. But yeah, my role here at Checkpoint over the couple decades that I've been here has been primarily focused around supporting, customers with their cybersecurity architectures. And like you said, covering the East Coast, you've got a lot of big influential verticals that are part of it. So large financials, New York City, Boston, Charlotte. And you've got a lot of biotech, Western Jersey, right here down the street here in Cambridge and so forth. And then of course, some of the probably the most influential hospitals, as well as educational organizations as well. So you're absolutely right. We're kind of spoiled here on the East Coast with very important companies and colleges and universities and organizations. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun working.
And there's examples to pull from and learn from and to it's been a good group. Again, we've been in this area. Mark is actually not far from here, but didn't make sense having in the studio today. We'll do it another time. We'll actually have you in because there's plenty more we'll talk about down the road. But to talk about supply chain, you've recently, I believe, been talking with some customers down the coast a little bit about supply chain specific issues. Is that correct?
Yeah, a couple things. So, I think let's do the easy, let's do the easy discussion first, right? The easy discussion is a lot of folks are started taking consideration, kind of what you talked about in your intro. you know, we understand supply chain from a physical sense, right? Goods and services moving in and out, whether they're international ports or our ports, or even from a supply chain perspective within the United States, right? There was a lot of that, and that became more and more. We became more aware of that just because, like you said, the pandemic and COVID and the restrictions. And you brought up an example earlier when we were talking about like the Suez Canal and how that disrupted things drastically. And I'm sure you'll talk about that more later. But the
One
other
little
side of
ship
it
goes
is,
askew and it shuts the world
oh,
down. It's
it's a roll down. Yeah. Yeah. And I had something on that ship that got delayed, like, and I was notified of such, right? So it happens, right? So then, but now this is the other side of the coin, right? Which is where I've been doing a little bit of speaking out in the educational space, specifically down at Lehigh University down in Pennsylvania. And we talked a little bit about not only obviously the physical side of the supply chain, but I'll say emerging, Eric and Chelsea, but it's not really emerging. It's been around for a while, but how the cybersecurity or the software supply chain is being impacted. We see it a lot with ransomware, right? Where we can talk about certain examples there. But now we see it purely from an application development perspective, where applications are getting targeted with malicious code before the app even becomes a production workload. So that's kind of like that evolving supply chain attack that we're seeing more and more often.
I want to dive deeper into that aspect, but before we move on from the physical, and I think the more relatable to people who aren't in technology, never mind cybersecurity, the physical supply chain also relates to services and things like utilities. And we've seen that, and we've talked about that in other episodes, where even disruptions to gas or electric or water.
Colonial Pipeline, Eric, right?
That's the one by name. If we want to bring it up again, that we've talked about other times too, that definitely that's a supply chain issue. If you can disrupt Colonial Pipeline, you can affect people getting gas, and that's where critical infrastructure has the physical pipeline as part of their challenge and their mandate to secure that. And so we know that that's under attack. It's very susceptible and it's fragile.
I was going to say it's kind of like a fragile thing, but also one that I think a lot of us who aren't familiar with supply chain, we don't really think about those things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, and we don't have to think of it as supply chain. It's critical infrastructure. We all know we need electricity, we need water, we need, trash removal, all these little things that we take for granted that we can, but they do have a supply chain. There are multiple providers, multiple levels of it. And that's, I think, the very relatable aspect of the supply chain, which does have significant cybersecurity concerns. Yeah. It's definitely something.
It's also, and why it's so important too, and I'm sure you guys will agree. I mean, there's lots of reasons why it's important, but on the physical side, a lot of it, that's usually sort of the competitive advantage of those organizations as well. How well they deliver packages, how well they deliver gas to us as consumers. Like, so that information is like super critical. And then when you talk about like, the infrastructure part of it, that's what that makes it even more, right? Because now you're talking about impacting, our daily lives and our livelihoods, honestly, right? That's why it's so targeted by whether it's nation states or what have you, is because that's the easiest way to cause disruption is to hit assets that control what we need every single day to live, right? Yeah. And those things happen to be healthcare, utilities, like all the things, right? We may be able to live with not getting an Amazon package once in a while, maybe. But we can't live without getting gas or getting that healthcare appointment, right? And that's really where things come into play.
If I don't have electricity, I can't even order the package in the first place.
It's true. That's exactly.
Or broadband or cellular signal. If you don't have data, so even the internet signal you have is arguably part of a supply chain.
Yeah. Well, so I'm a brat about my packages too. So if I can't get it, I am mad.
Understandably. Again, we've been spoiled and we take it for granted, but it's fragile.
Are these issues like new, or has this been going on for a long time? We're just starting to talk about it, or?
It's a good question. I don't think it's new, but I think it comes to light when there's a significant disruption, like Colonial Pipeline, or like the Suez Canal issue, when there's something, or the pandemic itself, which had multiple effects at multiple links in the chain.
Right.
It wasn't just one thing; it was the whole thing was disrupted.
A lot of things, yeah.
So it makes it a little bit more apparent. But I think I believe we've seen an uptick in cyber attacks against links in the supply chain, because you can use the adage of you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if you want to disrupt services like critical infrastructure, you don't have to go at the power company necessarily. You can go at some other link in the chain, or you don't have to disrupt Amazon or attack DDoS Amazon. You can jam a ship into the Suez Canal in a way that none of the packages can make it across the Atlantic, and you have other ways of causing disruptions, especially Mark mentioned nation state. And it comes down to motivation.
Yep.
You're doing it for financial gain competitively, or to sell your stuff instead of their stuff because you can't get their stuff, or is it a political motivation? And
what is the most common motivation that you've seen recently?
For physical supply chain disruptions, attacks?
For like the cyber side of it. Is it for financial gain or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's actually, this is probably really, there's two, you guys just created two awesome segues. So I think one segue is to answer your question, right? Yeah, that's your job, right? It's good. So one, to answer your question, I think, Chelsea, right? I think the most common supply chain motivation, which is not uncommon, is actually the monetary part of it, right? And that's why ransomware is usually like the sort of the most common way to create a disruption in a supply chain, because they can take over, an organization's way to execute and transact business. And that affects the physical part, but the cyber part is the ransomware part. And of course, what's the reason why you have ransomware attacks other than disruption or making a political statement? Is for them to pay the ransom. That's why it's called ransomware, right? Or the multiple levels of extortion. So that's like one great segue. The other great segue that you guys just brought up too is the digital, the big words that are overused, but digital transformation. So that's where we can go down a whole other path, right? Where we can talk about how people are transforming how they do business, likely accelerated because of the pandemic, right? Moving more things to the cloud, finding ways of doing it, being able to support things remotely. And because of that, now that whole software supply chain aspect comes into play, which is the same exact thing that you guys just laid out, maybe on the physical side. But instead of attacking an application, I'm going to attack an open source library that the application or the big company is actually going to use. And unbeknownst to them, now they've actually adopted compromised code into a larger piece of software, and that becomes compromised. And the outcome is exactly what we just talked about from a physical perspective, right? The verdict is different, but the outcome is exactly the same. Monetary benefit, disruption, brand disruption as well. Like, a really trusted brand becomes an untrusted brand, right?
Yep.
This is what makes it so exciting is the exact stuff that you guys just kind of brought up.
I love that you say exciting too, because I feel the same way. Like this is exciting. It's awful. It's bad. We're trying to stop it. We're trying to help defend against it, but it's exciting because, wow, I never saw that before. I used to be the same way with viruses. Like, ooh, that was really creative the way they did that thing. It's awful. If they could use their powers for good, wouldn't that be wonderful? But I mean,
I felt bad to be like, it's kind of brilliant. Like,
yeah,
it is.
Yeah,
it absolutely is.
It's a bad thing. I know.
Well, but the segue you mentioned, that second segue towards the digital and the software supply chain, it is very similar if you look at it the right way, but it also leads to a lot of confusion. And I've been in conversations where you get people talking about supply chains and you find out a little ways in when it starts to get weird that they're talking about different supply chains. Somebody's talking about the physical, the delivery of services or delivery of goods, and the other is talking about the software driving that and how they got updates bad. And it's, again, they're similar and that we use the same term. I think we need to almost start differentiating between physical supply chain and digital supply chain to be a little more clear. Let's
throw out another acronym, right? That, maybe not everybody's heard of who's listening in, but software deployment lifecycle, SDLC, right? So that's really what we're talking about now is that, when people build applications and workloads, there's this whole life cycle, right? there's this whole process of developing, moving it to sort of I'm overly simplifying it, right? But moving it out of like, sort of the pre-production stage into like development, and then eventually gets into production, right? Mm-hmm. So that's really what we're talking about, right? When we talk about the cyber part, is like how early can attackers embed their attacks in that software deployment lifecycle, right? And then our job, right, as I'll call ourselves cyber defenders, or us in the prevention space, we want to help customers and organizations identify those pieces as early as in the pipeline as possible, so that they don't actually get a compromised production workload, right? And that's what this is all about. And we have lots of other examples we can talk. We can talk about software deployment, supply chain attacks, and email even, right? So there's a lot of different ways we can talk about it, but at sort of its root level, from the purest application side, is about protecting software developers and companies from downloading open source code or distribution that is already compromised, and that becomes part of their life cycle, right?
That's really what we're talking about. Is like the most susceptible or the most common, like.
Well, maybe to relate this to people that are listening that may have heard of somebody, if we name a couple like Log4j or some others that were very high profile, well discussed supply chain disruptions, where, I mean, if I remember it correctly, it was someone had gotten themselves into the production environment, into the production community. When you're talking about open source, and this is one of those interesting aspects when you talk about open source software, that anyone can see the source code, they can get into, they can find bugs themselves without having to bang at them. They can look in the code for them. But someone had gotten themselves in a position to contribute code to the project, and ultimately was able over a long period of time to gain that trust and then start injecting problematic code that then could eventually be exploited. But it had been allowed to spread to a massive.
Another big one too, Eric, is Move It. Move It's another great example, right? Ended up being a SQL, type of issue, but that had a huge ramification on varying verticals very, very quickly, right? So, we could talk all day about all the different examples, but I think the really the center of why we're talking about this is to really create that awareness between the physical side and the virtual side, right? And then we can even get even more specific on the application side, maybe in the future. But I think
we'll probably do separate episodes on each of those different supply chains. But
totally.
Here in the limited time we have today, just to discuss what the differences are and help everyone understand. It's not just one supply chain to rule them all. There's different aspects, and it's important to be on the same page when you're talking about how to secure them.
I was going to say, I also think it's important that we discuss the best ways to protect yourself or secure those supply chains then.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, recommendations and advice that might apply to all or specific supply chains. Mark, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, we'll bring up two examples, right? One example is that we'll talk about the examples of people downloading malicious distributions as part of their development process for applications. All that code that you're pulling down before you actually implement it into your life cycle, you should be scanning it and understanding it, right? That are these distributions, are these open source components, are they malicious before you even enter into the pipeline? That's something that obviously is super common in the space. And then also at the same time, also scanning your own code libraries to make sure that you're not putting secrets out there that people can actually grab from maybe your GitHub repository that's also public, right? So that's one piece. The other one I want to bring up as well.
Before we move on from that one, I want to interrupt you for just a second, because one of the challenges you see there is from the developer side, scanning, inspecting, testing, that all implies delay and roadblocks.
Exactly.
And that's where you get resistance. That's why, because it seems like obvious, of course, test, inspect, scan your code. Why wouldn't you?
Right.
But when there are, deadlines to get this new release out, you're up against it. So it's kind of balancing security against other things. Sorry.
I think that the biggest misnomers to that point, Eric, is that these scans can take like literally seconds to get done. So you can still have that speed and scale of the cloud and quick application development and not impede the productivity of the actual developers, right? So that's our job, right? As sort of evangelists to get that word out, because it's something that could be missed that shouldn't be.
Yeah, I think the bigger inconvenience is probably just in the changing of the process, because at some point you have to introduce that new link in the chain, because that's essentially what it becomes, is a new link in the chain of getting software from the developer to production. You've got this scanning and testing chain link, getting it there. But once it's there, it's a very strong and solid link, and it doesn't add time or delays all that much at all. So it's
like human resistance then, just because of changing
building, and it's another step but it's about prioritizing security and making it a higher profile component. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you, but
so number 2, you want me going on number 2?
Sure.
Yes.
So number 2, it's and again, we could probably do a whole half an hour on this too, but the biggest, this is not new information to anybody, but the biggest vector that compromise starts from is still email, right? All these dozens and dozens of years later. And so what we're seeing an uptick in as well is where malicious actors are jumping in the supply chain email exchange of, say, invoices, right, or payments, so that what ends up happening is that people are paying invoices, or they're accepting terms with their vendors they do business with, but what they don't realize is that they've been compromised, and they're actually accepting terms and making payments to people that are impacting their own supply chain in terms of procurement. And we're seeing a lot of that going on. And again, that's where things like, I know you guys talked about in other episodes as well, around artificial intelligence and the ability to leverage that power of machine learning to be able to discern when somebody is creating a malicious attempt to disrupt the supply chain over an email exchange about invoices or what have you. And that's another big part too. So we could, again, we don't have to dive too deep into that, because that's a half an hour on its own, but it's super, super important, because that's the most common vector of compromise, and also a very easy way, because we all know how complicated business email compromise is getting, where if I'm going to attack Eric, right, I'm going to attack him from somebody he already trusts, and then because of that,
we've talked about that in the past, Chelsea, that it's about that weakest link. The attacker doesn't want to go with the strongest link; they want to go with the weakest link, and that is often still email.
Well, I have a question. So I get, I know of a lot of people getting the messages from UPS, and it'll be like, your package is being delayed, or you have to pick it up. It's trying to get you to click on a link.
Yep.
But is their supply chain compromised then? Because how does it even know?
Well, if you look, I've gotten, I don't even know how many dozens or hundreds of texts over the last year, especially from UPS or USPS.
Yep.
As well. And it's a text message from USPS saying we have your package in the office, in the post office. Call this number, click this link. But if you look, it's a text message from an international number.
Yeah.
Why would the United States Postal Service be sending me a text from an international? So again, like with email, looking for telltale signs. There are things you can do to protect yourself. We've talked about elsewhere, and you hear about all the time.
And now we have our third episode that we can talk about, is brain impersonation.
We're just making more and more work for ourselves. The more we talk, the more we try and solve.
Because brain impersonation goes across all of this stuff, Chelsea, to your point, right? Yeah. That text that you're getting, or the email that you're getting, or the reputation of that brand outside of their infrastructure. So from a continuous threat, external management perspective, CTEM, right? How do you protect a brand passively so that their brand's not being compromised in social media or on the dark web or what have you? That's episode number 3 that we've kicked off.
Anybody can claim to be the USPS or UPS or whoever and send a text. It doesn't mean they are. Same thing with email. I remember even many, many years ago having to prove to somebody that you could send an email that says your name is whatever you want, and from whatever email address you want. Even the sender email address can be spoofed incredibly easy.
Yep.
I think we've been doing that, Eric, before we even knew each other 20 years ago.
Yeah, but there are still ways to help prove it. You just have to go into the details and the message headers and the actual pieces that most email applications don't show you.
But to that point, it is commonly, I know a ton of people who get the same messages. And we do associate it with that brands sometimes now,
because
you know?
they say they are, and
Yeah.
we're too trusting. And I think hopefully society is learning to be a little less trusting or know
Do our
what to
due
look
diligence
at.
too.
Yeah. And we talked about this on our SHTF episode.
Mhm.
When you do get a message and you do think it is UPS
Mhm.
and you are waiting for a package from UPS, you know,
Yeah.
the planets align just right that it might hit and you're vulnerable. Instead of clicking the link in that text, look up the number for UPS and call UPS, or go onto their website and log in,
Yeah.
but typing the URL, not clicking that link.
Hey, I was going to say, don't just
And
click
it's
the
a
link.
simple way. And most vendors, manufacturers, service providers, they are all tolerant of you calling them and asking them what seems like a dumb question. Do you have a package for me? And they'll help you track it down because they know that they have people that are being victimized by fake stuff. So it's go the manual route to add again, maybe a roadblock and a hurdle into your process, but it's safer than clicking this link that you're not sure of.
Yeah.
Sure.
So which of the additional episodes do we want to dive into now? I think we need to kind of go the other way.
Yeah.
Have we resolved a little bit? I mean, we started with the question of what exactly is the supply chain. And I think first, there isn't just the supply chain, there's multiple supply chains.
I think what do people need to know to be doing or focusing on to protect themselves more? Like, what if you had to pick one?
Don't be the weakest link. Don't be the one who clicks things in that email and does things they shouldn't. That's one thing. You know, be aware of it. Be aware that, you know,
So
what
for
the
companies and
ramifications are.
stuff, though, what is?
I think the number one thing to do, Chelsea, is companies need to invest energy as well as planning on how they leverage components of their architecture that they don't own themselves. So, and that investment would be technology. That investment could be people. That investment could be process. But they need to invest probably in all three of those areas so that the exact things we talked about are prevented. Because without preventing these, like this isn't something that you can detect, right? And say, oh, we'll run a report every Thursday about it. Like these things need to be prevented right at the beginning, because if they're not prevented, not only do you have compromise, but then you actually have a lot of wasted time, because then you have to redo stuff after you've already completed it and created a production workload. And that's like the worst thing. So I think, the one word, Chelsea, is invest. You got to invest somewhere.
Today, you're going to detect it tomorrow. You're going to detect it the next day. And once, if you prevent
that doesn't work anymore. So
your best offense is really your defense.
Well, I think like anything, it starts with at least understanding. I will say you do have to detect where the problems are.
Right.
You know, what are the links? It's doing that analysis, that introspection. Where do we have susceptibility, whether it's within our own organization and our own processes, or as Mark said, those externals that we're dependent on, other vendors and partners that we have to interact with. Are they the weak links?
I was going to say, you have to find
what can we do
identify
to shore up the communications and have them prove to us or us prove to them whether they're going to be the problem or not. But it's putting the thought in and caring. Starts with caring. You have to care first and know that this is important, and then you have to start doing some analysis and some thinking about it and being open to maybe you do have the weakest link within your control, and then doing something about it through prevention and
like
making sure it's not exploited.
Okay. That makes sense.
Something.
100%.
Any other thoughts?
No, I couldn't agree more. You know, and I think as, you know, we'll use the big overused term again, but as more and more people transform how they do things, leverage SaaS for more things and less things that they're developing on their own, this is just going to become more of an issue. And let's just be honest, the attackers have been successful with these over and over and over again. So it's not going to go away, right? So we have to be cognizant of that, invest, prevent, and educate. You know, I think if those three things are taken seriously, you know, we can put ourselves in a much better position.
Yeah, I think to go back to the question of why are we talking about it so much more now, and you pointed out SaaS and cloud, and I think that's what's happened with so much shift to moving workloads and servers and things into the cloud. It's basically made our chains more complex. It's
even more simple, Eric, right? Like we leverage things online more than we ever had before. Like, and we say that every single year, That's not changing either, right? So that's why these emails work, right? That's why business email compromise works. That's why brand reputation is a thing, because we're not going the other direction. Like if any direction is, we're going to go more towards, things that are done, via, the internet, or via applications, or via social media, or via, there are going to be different avenues, right? So it's both sides are going to continue to increase. And we see that, right? Our own Checkpoint research, the number of attacks don't go down. They go up, right? And that's not going to change either.
So now is the time to start becoming aware of this and start preventing it, because it's just going to get worse, right?
That's why we talk about it.
That answered my question about why it was so important, or why it seems to keep being mentioned, but it seems like it's something we need to be talking about a lot more.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Mark.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back on with you, I'm sure, to discuss
many other things. We built a pipeline ourselves, so we'll have to figure that out too.
Yes.
So. We'll talk. Hopefully I'll see you soon as well. And thanks so much for being with us.
Yes.
And for everyone else, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening.
And stay
safe.